Hello, travelers. Welcome to Oceans Week at Reach the World. My name is Tim, and for over 20 years, Reach the World has inspired youth to become curious, confident, and compassionate global citizens. This week, in partnership with the Explorers Club and in collaboration with ocean advocates around the world, we're sharing kid-friendly stories of ocean exploration, conservation, and wonder with members of our global community. You can find a complete calendar of live stream events and much, much more at athome.reachtheworld.org. Today, Reach the World is thrilled to welcome Philippe and Ashlan Cousteau. Philippe is an explorer, a TV host and producer, and author, and he's the co-founder of EarthEcho International, a nonprofit organization that seeks to inspire young people to act now for a sustainable future. Ashlan Cousteau is a veteran journalist and environmental advocate who's journeyed around the world in search of stories to entertain and inspire people. Together, Philippe and Ashlan are co-hosts of the Travel Channel series Caribbean Pirate Treasure. They're joining us today to talk about one of their past expeditions together to the dead zones of Chesapeake Bay, and I can't wait to learn more. We're also joined today by on-camera students who are eager to ask their questions to Philippe and Ashlan. If you're watching via the live stream, please use the YouTube chat bar to let us know where you're watching from and what grade you're in. You can also share your questions for Philippe and Ashlan in the YouTube chat bar, and we'll get to as many questions as we can in the next 45 minutes. So without any further delay, it's time to dive into the topic of our ocean's dead zones and what we can do about them. Philippe and Ashlan Cousteau, welcome to Reach the World.
Tim, thank you so much for having us, and students, thank you for joining us. We love that you all are citizens of the world, and we're so excited to be here.
Especially on such a wonderful week, World Oceans Week, celebrating the ocean, everything it does for us. And in particular, the idea of everything we can do for it. So today, as Tim said, we're going to take you through a little expedition, an adventure that we had about 5 years ago, where we explored the Chesapeake Bay, one of the largest bodies of water in the United States. And it's a pretty exciting, pretty amazing place, but unfortunately, it's facing some pretty serious threats from humanity. Not a surprise for anybody watching this that the ocean is facing some challenges from people. But we wanted to walk you through a little bit and kind of talk you through some of our what we do. First at EarthEcho, we're an organization, we're a nonprofit organization, and we focus on education and opportunities, which is why we're so thrilled to be able to work with another terrific organization like Reach the World that focuses on the same kind of idea, that really young people have the power to change the world. We reach young people all over the world, not unlike Reach the World, and provide all sorts of resources to classrooms at home as well. Really focus on STEM, science, and the environment, with a particular focus on the ocean. So, as I said, about 5 or 6 years ago, we launched our program called EarthEcho Expedition. That's a series of programs where we travel around the world. We've got actually lots of them online. We've been to, let's see, Australia, looking at plastics in the ocean.
The UK.
We went to the UK.
Looking at fishing.
At fishing, that's right. We were here in Los Angeles area, where we're calling from today, looking at water scarcity. And let's see, next year we're going to be going, I think the plan is to Puerto Rico, looking at energy. But our first expedition was looking at dead zones. Now, a lot of people probably don't know what dead zones are. They exist all over the world, though.
And it's true, and it's something that, you know, it's a place in the water where everything's dead. That's why it's called a dead zone, and it can happen for multiple reasons.
Yeah. So in the Chesapeake Bay, for example, it's the primary cause of this dead zone. What a dead zone is from around the watershed, both the water pollution and, believe it or not, air pollution. And we'll get to that. A lot of people have heard of watersheds. A lot of people understand how water can bring nutrients into the ocean, but actually the air does the same thing. But we have a little video here that I want to show you that'll talk a little bit more.
I'm on an adventure to explore one of the most extraordinary ecosystems in the entire world. But it's an ecosystem that's plagued by an invisible menace, one that threatens the very survival of the Chesapeake Bay. And we're about to embark on a journey to find out more. The Chesapeake Bay is our nation's largest estuary, a transition zone where fresh fresh water from 6 states and the District of Columbia meets the Atlantic Ocean's salt water. As these two worlds commingle, they form a nursery for many species, including birds, fish, and mammals. But not everything is as it should be, because part of the Chesapeake is a dead zone, an area that is devoid of life. Now, to really understand dead zones, I'm going to have to get in the water and see it for myself. Dead zones are threatening one of the bay's keystone species. It's an organism whose presence affects all other species, including the livelihood of people who make their living from the bay. We're on a quest to find oysters. Steve Allen manages aquatic restoration programs with the Oyster Recovery Partnership, an organization that is devoted to reintroducing oysters in places from where they've vanished. Steve, what can we expect to see down there?
We're going to be diving on probably about 3-year-old oysters that were produced in our hatchery in Cambridge, Maryland. Should be nice oyster clumps. It's one of our main restoration sites that we've been doing for the past 3 years here.
Terrific. Let's get the water. Excited. These hoods,
They're just protection. There are sea nettles, which are like jellyfish.
more than a century ago, oysters filled the bay. And this region supplied nearly half the world's demand, but a combination of pollution, over-harvesting, and disease killed them off, crippling the bay's most effective filtering system and forever changing the lives of the bay's watermen and fishermen. Oysters are known as ecosystem engineers. As they build their shells, they're creating places for other animals to live.
Oysters are all covered with barnacles and mussels, providing substrate for each other.
That's not all they do. Oysters are filter feeders, taking in water and removing organic material from it to feed on. They cleanse as they filter, so an entire oyster reef acts like the bay's kidneys. One of these oysters can filter 50 gallons of water. That is remarkable. And what I find even more shocking is some of the statistics about how there's 1% of the traditional historical oyster population left here in the Chesapeake Bay. That's 1%. Steve and this project hope to kickstart Mother Nature by adding more oyster habitats and help them continue their comeback.
So,
Well, what I thought was so interesting in rewatching that video was the Chesapeake Bay. It used to provide the world one half of the world's oysters.
I know, and now there's only 1% of the historical numbers left. So the
1%.
impact on people's jobs and livelihoods is another really important thing to remember. So as we were doing this exploration, this adventure, that's one of the things that really kept coming forward is like when we affect the health of the environment, we're affecting people as well.
Yeah, and I also like to point out that you said that the oysters are like the kidneys of the ocean, filtering out the bad stuff and giving you good stuff in return. I love that.
So essentially what happens in a dead zone, and I might actually go back a few slides here. What happens in a dead zone is that you get an area, as Ashlan said earlier, in the ocean that, or in any body of water, it can be fresh or salt, where nothing can really survive. And that happens when nutrients, primarily things like nitrogen and phosphorus, which are like fertilizer, go into the water. And that fertilizer, just like plants on land like fertilizer, plants in the water like fertilizer. So algae, especially, feeds on that fertilizer and grows out of control.
It's called an algae bloom. It's like,
exactly. And when that algae dies, bacteria, that's an animal, eats that dead algae. Now, as an animal, it consumes oxygen. And because there's so much of the bacteria growing, because there's so much food in all that algae, it eats and breathes all the oxygen in the water faster than the water can replenish it. So without oxygen in the water,
nothing can be there. So all the
because
fish,
nothing can breathe.
yeah. So it's called a dead zone because everything's either dead or it's just not there.
Yeah, and it swims away because there's nothing for it, no air, no oxygen for it to breathe.
And what's important about this map and what we alluded to and which we'll talk about is, you know, when you have a dead zone, it's not just because of that area. It's because of all the water coming in from miles and miles away from different states and sometimes from different countries coming into that area and bringing all of the bad stuff with it.
Exactly. So you look at this is about a 60,000 square mile area here, all the way up into Cooperstown, New York, that flows down into the Chesapeake Bay. And I know we've got some young people from Washington, D.C. that are joining us today, and probably from other states around here.
And one from Canada.
And one from Canada. That's right. But I think Sydney's calling from, is joining us from Washington, D.C. And you look at this place, and it's pretty amazing to think Cooperstown, New York, all the way up in New York, is rivers are bringing water down into the Chesapeake Bay. So let's slide back here.
So let's talk about the main issues that really are the main areas, we should say, that kind of create these dead zones. So let's talk about what happens when we build cities. Should we play the video first, then I don't repeat the video?
You know, I think I took the video out actually, because
okay.
in the interest of time, I took the video out so we could.
See, my husband's changing things up on me last minute, guys.
Let's keep her on her toes.
That's okay. Okay, so what happens when we build cities? So we all live in cities or visited these urban areas, and what happens is we, as humankind, we build these impervious surfaces. So that means all the surfaces in our cities that don't let water penetrate. So anything from roads to sidewalks to buildings to rooftops to parking lots. I mean, really anything that when the precipitation comes down in the form of rain, sleet, hail, snow, it doesn't have anywhere to go, because normally it would go and it would penetrate into the ground, which would be a natural filter going back out to another water source, another water part of the watershed. So when we have these impervious surfaces, the water doesn't have anywhere to go except for to be, to run off on the streets and into our storm drains. And usually those storm drains go directly into our natural water source, be it a stream, a lake, a river, or into the ocean. And that urban runoff, that storm water, also carries with it all the trash and pollution from our cities. So everything that we can see, like plastic bottles and bags and trash and forks that people have, plastic forks that people have accidentally dropped on the ground, all the way down to oil runoff. That actually, the oil runoff from our city streets actually gives our ocean more oil than an oil spill every year, a lot more. And then other things like the nitrogen and the phosphorus that cause the dead zones. So how we build our cities is so important. We need to make sure that we can try to treat or at least capture some of this storm runoff before it goes back into our natural water.
So our cities are a big source of pollution that goes in and causes things like dead zones, in particular because when you think that Washington, D.C., for example, is right there on the Chesapeake, and so many other cities, Baltimore, etc., is on the Chesapeake Bay, because we tend to build big cities along the coast and on water, that usually runs right off there. So the next source of nitrogen and phosphorus, primarily nitrogen, that we want to talk about is it's also when we eat. And if you notice the titles of these, where we live, how we build our cities, what happens when we eat, these are things that all of us do every day. Now, when we eat, farming actually is a considerable source of nitrogen. It's mostly from fertilizer that's applied to the fields, but it can also come from the animal waste here, like these cows. And it's just under 50% of the nitrogen that goes into the Chesapeake Bay comes from the farms that are in Pennsylvania and New York, and that place in that big watershed map that I showed you all earlier. And so when you think about how we manage our farms, how we manage food, that has a really big impact, essentially preventing runoff. the same idea that Ashlan was talking about in cities, you get manure. So cow waste has a lot of nitrogen in it. Or you get fertilizer that's added to the fields. And if it's not managed properly, when it rains or snows, it will allow all of that waste to just run freely into the water, into the rivers and the streams, which then run downstream into the ocean, eventually, or into the Chesapeake Bay and estuary perhaps first, and then into the ocean. So when we eat, our food system, agriculture has a really big impact on the ocean ultimately.
What happens when we flush? So Philippe was talking about cow manure, but we also have to talk about our manure. Yes, what we put in our toilets, what we put down our drains, what goes down our showers, really anything from our homes can end up and will end up back in our water system. The question is, how much does it get cleaned? So many large cities are able to create wastewater management and clean that water and put it back into the water system, back into our true water system, so we can all either drink it or it goes back in nicely treated back into the natural water sources. But when you live in a place that's maybe a smaller city or a small town or a very rural area, it's very expensive to treat that water. So sometimes that water just goes directly into your stream or your lake or your river. Or even if you think about some really tiny, small islands all around the world, they don't have any space or capital to build a wastewater system. So their wastewater can just go directly into the ocean. Now, like Philippe said about the nitrogen and the phosphorus from the farms, obviously our poop is just the same. So our nitrogen and phosphorus also goes into the water. But there's many things that we can do. For instance, if you want to make sure that things going down your drains, like your sink, your shower, and your laundry, just look for things that don't have phosphorus in the ingredients, and then you don't have to worry about it going down your drain.
Yeah. So cleaning products and soaps and things like that oftentimes do have phosphates in them that are bad. So that's one thing that we can reduce. So yeah, when we flush the toilet, that actually has a big impact on the ocean, imagine. And then finally, fossil fuels. Now this is a really interesting one that a lot of people aren't aware of. We all talked earlier about what a watershed is, right? So this picture right here, this is the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Again, all the way up to Cooperstown, New York, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, the District of Columbia. All these places, water from all those places flows into the Chesapeake Bay. But there's also such thing as an airshed. Now, the airshed of the Chesapeake Bay is 9 times bigger than the watershed. The watershed is about 64,000 square miles. The airshed is over 500,000 square miles. Now, what that means is sources of pollution from industrial sources or mobile sources like airplanes, cars, all through about 500 square miles. That goes all the way to Ohio, Tennessee, other states, all around the Chesapeake Bay. That air moves, of course, we know air, wind moves and carries those pollutants that eventually settle back down into the land or into the water, and that flows into places like the Chesapeake Bay and ultimately in the ocean. So nitrogen is in the air, and it's part of this nitrogen cycle. We keep pumping more nitrogen into the air through pollution like coal-fired power plants or cars. And so it's estimated that about 30% of the pollution that ends up in the Chesapeake Bay is not just from land-based sources, our watershed, but actually from air sources of pollution. That's pretty shocking when we think about an airshed. Before we did this expedition, honestly, I didn't really know that airsheds were a thing. And they're, of course, all over the world. So one of the things we wanted to do, also, as we've only got a few minutes left here before we go into question and answer, is now what do we do about this, right? Yeah. There's so much we can do. And one of the things I also wanted to point out is on the course of this expedition, we met with park rangers like you see here. We met with scientists, politicians, people that work, the water keepers, people that work for nonprofits, communications folk, press and media, farmers, all sorts of people from all sorts of different walks of life. So no matter what you're interested in, no matter what you like to do, there's a way and a role that you can play in helping to help the oceans and the environment. But you don't have to wait till you grow up. So we're going to play 2 quick videos here for you that are our Youth in Action series to show what some of the young people in these communities are doing to help the Chesapeake Bay and the ocean.
Young people are making a difference in the health of our planet through service learning. In every community in our journey, the EarthEcho Expedition team met with youth taking action to improve their local environment. I was students here from the Wiley H. Bates Middle School, and then Abby and AJ, part of the Oyster Education Partnership with the Annapolis Maritime Museum. Tell me about what's going on here.
The oyster shell has been like a mother or father to the spat because spat need a hard surface to attach to the oyster.
So AJ, what exactly is a spat?
A spat is something that is going to grow in the oysters and it's going to help go to the water.
So that's what a spat is, baby oyster?
Yes.
So what are you doing with this basket then? What's the whole plan?
We are trying to measure the spat to see how they're growing and see if some may be detached.
Well, we're putting all the creatures that we find right into this little box right here so we can check them out. In this one little basket are all these animals that use these oysters to hide it. It's like an apartment building. What happened to the oysters over the last few years? Do you all know?
The bay has gotten dirtier. Oyster population has plummeted down as oysters help with filtering and cleaning the bay.
Have you learned about other things that you can do to help the bay?
Well, first recycle and don't throw the trash on the ground because when it rains, the water all washes down into the bay.
Why do you think it's so important to come out here and see what's in your water?
We pollute it and it needs to stay clean and they help us to stay clean so we should help other oysters too.
Well, why do you like learning science in this way?
In the classes, you're just reading books and writing stuff about it. But when you're out here, you can actually see what's really going on in the class.
AJ and Abby, thank you so much for showing us the oysters and showing us your backyard. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for coming.
Okay, that's one. We're going to show you one more.
EarthEcho International recognizes that young people are making a positive difference in the health of our planet by seizing on opportunities to engage in service learning initiatives in their communities. Our expedition joined teams working to improve the Chesapeake Bay watershed.
Ashlan Cousteau here with some new friends from Fort Garrison Elementary School, and they are part of what's called the Green Team. Now, what do you guys do as the Green Team?
We walk around every morning or every afternoon and we collect our recycling bin.
What else have you done besides recycling?
We don't carpool and we only take buses and walk. And we have put down the pollution rate. The air is more clean.
Every student here at Fort Garrison takes the bus or walks to school every day. That's over 400 students. So what else do you guys do in the classroom to keep it green?
We also use the lights off, so we remember to turn the lights off.
That's so great. So why do you guys think it's so important to recycle and make sure that we have a healthy planet?
So we don't pollute our earth and it's not overfilled with junk. And if we don't recycle, all the pollution and trash will go in the ocean and hurt the animals.
So it's helping the planet and helping ourselves also, right? And do you guys think it's a responsibility that you have, or do you just like doing this for fun?
Well, I think it's both because I like helping the earth and making sure that it's a safe place for all of us.
Good job, you guys. I think we all should get a high five for that. Green school, green team.
What I thought was so cool about the last group is they all were used to carpooling at their school, like most kids, and they would come out and their parents would be in their cars waiting for them. And they realized one day, they were like, gosh, it's so hard to breathe out here. So they told the school that they wanted to stop the carpooling. And some of the parents were not happy about that. but the kids wanted to do it. And so they changed the adult behavior. They're the ones that made that rule, and then the adults followed it. So it just goes to show just how much influence you all have over everyone in your community, be it your parents or business owners or your peers. Like you guys have an awesome amount of power.
That's right. Changing the world, changing communities. As Asha said, the parents, they were used to just driving up and leaving the car on and sitting there in the car with the exhaust kicking out while they waited for the kids to come out, and it polluted the whole area around the school. So these young people made a big difference. You saw AJ and Abby in the earlier film about what they're doing and helping to grow oysters and trying to restore oysters. Back 100 years ago, there are stories and photos of oyster shoals coming out of the water and oysters as big as dinner plates in the Chesapeake Bay. But directly because of pollution and overfishing, there's 1% is your 1% of the population of oysters left. And that means a lot of people out of jobs over the last few centuries, just over a century, actually. And so the health of the ocean is a big issue for all of us, and we all have a role to play in making it better. So taking action, that's what those young people were doing. And that's we want all of you to remember, that it's not just about expeditions going and exploring the Chesapeake Bay or exploring Australia or these places that we get to go. It's about exploring our backyards, it's about exploring our communities, and it's about recognizing what we can do in those communities to make the world a better place. And I think that's the best kind of adventure, is how we can help each other and help the planet. So from there, 25 minutes is up. We wanted to jump into some questions with you all.
Yeah, perfect. Ashlan, Philippe, that was awesome presentation. I love your message, because especially when you talk about the airshed and the watershed, it's hard to imagine any kid who's listening in the United States or North America or Canada right now who doesn't live within, a watershed somewhere. It might not be the Chesapeake Bay, but your actions are impacting water somewhere.
That's a great point, that, we all live in a watershed and of course an airshed as well. And, one of the challenges that we find is a lot of people, period, adults, mostly adults, don't even know where their water comes from, but it does actually come from nature. It comes from your watershed.
It doesn't just come from the tap.
That's right. Or a bottle, or, a water fountain, be it in an aquifer, be it from a lake, a river system. Here in California, we get a lot of water from the Colorado River that's piped hundreds of miles into Los Angeles. Or in some cases directly from the ocean through desal. So, we all get our water from somewhere, and healthy water means healthy life. And it's all part of one big cycle. There's no more fresh water today than there ever was. And most of the fresh water on Earth is locked up in ice. So the fresh water that we do have access to is really precious.
Awesome, great points.
I know, I'm kind of thirsty myself.
If you guys wouldn't mind coming out of screen share, it will allow us to see you a little bit bigger, and we'll jump right into student questions, because I know the students are super eager to ask you your questions.
Well, and before we do, I just want to share,
sure.
since we're going to come out of this, if y'all have any questions beyond this or want to find out what we're up to at EarthEcho, you'll notice a trend here. It's pretty much all at EarthEcho is all our social, on Instagram and Facebook, etc. And just you can email us at education@EarthEcho, or of course Tim and Research World folks know how to get a hold of us, and our website is earthecho.org. So let's jump out of, if I can, how do I stop? There we go. Stop share.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, here we are. We've got some students who are so excited to ask you questions. I want to go right to William and Zoey, because they've got their hands raised digitally and they seem like they're ready to go. So William, Zoey, go ahead with your questions.
Hello, our question was, it seems like you've been like a lot of places. So,
what place was the cleanest the water was the cleanest?
Ooh, that is a great question, and one that we have never gotten. So good job, you guys.
Wow, yeah.
The cleanest water. Oh, Alaska.
Oh yeah.
Or
Iceland. You go Alaska.
Oh, okay. So Philippe and I got to do an expedition where we went up to Alaska to watch the big caribou migration. And that's actually the longest migration of any land mammal in North America. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. And so we went up to Alaska to, what's the mountain range?
Oh my goodness. Brooks Mountain Range?
Oh yeah, the Brooks Mountain Range, into a big wilderness park. And there we were able to find the caribou, and wolves were chasing them. And we saw a bear, and it was incredible. But my favorite thing that we did
was for the first time in my life, I was able to take my water bottle and dip it in a stream. I had to make sure there was no caribou poop around, but there wasn't, so we were good. So I dipped my water in a stream and I drank from it, and it was awesome. So I would have to say the ANWR, it's the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. There we go.
Yeah, that was one of those places we were camping up there and filming. That was pretty amazing. And I would say also Iceland. So we got to go and film in Iceland as well. And one time we were out on a glacier, and the ice on that glacier, they believe, froze around the 1400s. So before Christopher Columbus. So we were there, and you know, glaciers move. That it's like a slow moving river of ice. And so the ice at the front of the glacier was breaking off and melting. So we took a piece of that ice that was breaking off of the glacier, and this water was like 600 years old. It frozen like 600 years ago. And so we took that back to back to our hotel room and let it melt in a big jar. And then that water is perfectly, like, incredibly clean. And we were able to drink that water that evening with dinner. So that was pretty cool as well.
Very cool. Great question. William, Zoe, I'll come right back to you. I want to give Sydney a chance to ask her first question. Sydney, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask away.
So what was the oldest oldest dead zone you've been to?
Ooh.
Oldest dead zone. Well, I think, you know, honestly, here in the United States, the Chesapeake Bay, that's why we chose the Chesapeake Bay. It's, you know, it's been industrialized around that part of the country for well over, you know, several hundred years. When you think about cities like Philadelphia and Baltimore, Washington, D.C., that have been around for a very, very long time, they've been dumping largely, you know, most of their waste, or the agricultural area that's been around in Pennsylvania and places like that for hundreds of years, has slowly been leaching into the Chesapeake Bay, and has resulted in the problems that we have now. And as the population of people has gone up, that amount of waste has just gone up as well. So we've really seen an impact in the last 100 years. But of course, humans, you know, in that area, at least industrialized in that area, goes back several hundred years. And then, of course, you know, with Native Americans, long before that. But they managed to do a much better job of having a light touch on the land than we have. So the Chesapeake Bay is probably arguably the oldest dead zone in the United States.
Okay, Sydney, great question. Kai, let's go to you. Are you ready with the question?
What is the deepest dead zone you've been to?
The deepest
Gulf of
dead
Mexico.
zone. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that was, yeah. So Philippe went during the BP oil spill.
Yeah.
So during the BP oil spill that happened in 2010, that big oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, Philippe went diving in it.
Yeah. So the Gulf of Mexico is thousands of feet deep. And unfortunately, it also has a very large dead zone. And that comes primarily from the Mississippi River. So the Ohio Valley and Tennessee and lots of those places that have lots of agriculture, a lot of that waste ends up going into these rivers that feed the Mississippi River, and that flows into the Gulf of Mexico.
The agricultural runoff that we were talking about before in the presentation.
That's right. So like manure and things like that from pigs and cows and chickens, but then also fertilizer that's put directly onto crops. And then, of course, there's New Orleans and lots of big cities along there, as Ashlan was talking about. And so the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico is about twice the size of the state of New Jersey. Think about that. That's really big. So we that's already been happening for decades and slowly growing every year. And then when the BP oil spill happened, that of course made things even worse. And so we went diving in the Gulf of Mexico to film the BP oil spill and everything that was happening there.
All right, great. Thank you for your question, Kai. Let's go back to William and Zoe. You've been very patient. Thank you. Go ahead and ask your question.
I was wondering if so Iceland and Alaska, like you said, seem to be closer to the Arctic or like higher up. Is there any reason why those two are both cleaner? Like that may connect to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that where we were in Alaska, there just weren't a lot of people there. So that was one reason why it was super clean. And same thing in Iceland. There's not that many people that live there. I've also been to Antarctica. And so I should say that it was very clean in Antarctica because the only people on Antarctica are scientists, and then a few lucky people like me that get invited down to kind of share the story of that continent. But yeah, honestly, you're so right, William. It's because there weren't a lot of people there. That's why it was so clean.
Yeah, great question. Good observation. Sydney, let's come back to you for your second question. Go ahead.
So I was wondering if the rain, because of air pollution, is the rain more dirty when it comes to the ground than it was a long time ago?
Yes, it is. So the rain will oftentimes wash particulate matter out of the atmosphere. As clouds gather and the rain falls through the air, there are these tiny little, molecules of nitrogen or nitrous oxide or mercury, heavy metals even, that will get into the rain and be washed out of the atmosphere and then land on the land. So yes, rain is one of those vectors, one of those ways that pollution is pulled out of the atmosphere and comes onto land.
And crazy enough, last year, they actually found that pieces of plastic were in the snowfall that happened over Yellowstone National Park. Think about that. So tiny, tiny, tiny pieces of plastic, microplastics that had probably been absorbed through the ocean, had made it all the way over and into the rainfall that then fell down into the middle of our country in that beautiful national park. So that's another thing to think about too. It's not just, chemicals also too, but it's, little pieces of plastic make it into the water also.
So microplastic, it's almost lighter than air, so it can evaporate with moisture up in the atmosphere. So it's not just the big plastic bottles and all the stuff that we see, but those plastic bottles, there's no such thing. This is really, really important. There's no such thing as a way. We like to say we throw things away. Nothing goes away. It goes somewhere. So wipe that expression out of your mentality, because it kind of gives us a free pass to think, oh, we're throwing it away. It's going away somewhere and we don't have to deal with it. But plastic in particular, it never goes away. All it does is break down into smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. And those pieces have different impacts on the environment. So a big piece of plastic or big, straw or something, we've all seen them like, choking a sea turtle or wrapping around the neck of something maybe. But as those pieces get smaller and smaller and smaller, like microplastics, they look like things like tiny organisms, like microscopic organisms like plankton in the ocean that is a food source for other animals. And so when those animals mistake plastic, tiny microscopic bits of plastic for plankton and eat them, then there's no nutrition in the plastic. You can't digest the plastic. It fills their stomachs and they starve on a full stomach. And that happens to birds eating small pieces of plastic, or fish and dolphins, things like that. So there's no such thing as a way, and that plastic breaks down until it's so small, as Ashlan said, it can go up into the atmosphere and come down in snow, which is pretty scary.
Wow. Sydney, thank you so much for that great question. Kai, let's go back to you. Would you like to ask another question?
Yep.
Go ahead.
What is the biggest airshed in the world?
That's a hard one.
Yeah, that's a really hard one. I would say that there are different degrees of airshed. So as you saw in the Chesapeake Bay, that is a large airshed at around 500,000 square miles. But in fact, the entire world is an airshed. So I did, for my show, Awesome Planet, which is a syndicated show that I host that is on Saturday mornings that y'all can check out as well. Saturday mornings usually on your local Fox channel. It's a program that we've been 6 seasons, and we travel all around the world on expeditions and adventures, looking at science and nature. But one of the things that we looked at was we were up at the NASA Goddard Science Center up in Maryland. And one of the things we investigated was how carbon tracks and travels around the world back and forth. And so if you look at these heat maps that NASA has from satellites, you can see that during the summertime or during the winter, depending on what part of the world you're in, there may be more carbon emissions in the winter because there's a lot of heating going on and things like that. and then slows down in the spring and then rises again in the summer because there's a lot of air conditioning, using a lot of energy for that. And so you'll see carbon emissions in China that's sweeping all the way over the Pacific Ocean and affecting us here on the west coast of California. And then you'll see carbon emissions from the east coast of the United States that's eventually through some wind and sometimes up in the jet stream coming along all the way to the west coast or all the way up into Canada or all the way down over the Atlantic Ocean. So in fact, the biggest airshed is the world. Carbon pollution from all over the world reaches other parts of the world. We know that sand in the Sahara, for example, comes along and lands in the Caribbean Sea. So we've seen it actually. And so that brings pollution with it too. That I think is probably the answer is that the whole world is an airshed.
Yeah, great question, Kai. Thank you
Great
so
question.
much. We have a question from Jacqueline on our live stream who's saying she lives near a city, as do many of our viewers today. Are there any other ideas that you can give us for ways that we can help stop with urban runoff? I know you touched on a few, but what in your experience have been some of the most effective ways that kids can get involved, especially in urban areas, with stopping urban runoff?
I think one of the best things you can do is really look at your trash management system or your waste management system to make sure, you know, are there enough trash cans in your neighborhood, in your town? Are there enough recycling bins in your town? Because, you know, sometimes, let's be honest, grown-ups can be lazy. And if they have some trash and they look around and they don't see a trash can, sometimes they throw it on the ground. So to make sure that there are enough trash cans, I think is a great thing. And kids can make sure, count them up in your neighborhood, count them up around your school and see how many there are and make sure that you think that there's enough. I think that's number one.
Then you can start a petition and you can get involved in local government. We've seen a lot of young people that have helped to pass laws and make rules. You saw those kids in school that changed the whole carpooling system and got the school buses engaged to be able to be enough school buses to take them all to school in the morning. So schools are actually another great place to start. Maybe if you remember in that video that we showed you, the kids writing signs on all the switches to remember to turn off the switches, going around to make sure there's enough recycling bins all throughout the school. What kind of low energy options are there? Changing light bulbs, low flush toilets, things like that. Ashlan worked with the Water Guardians here in California, in LA, on a program where young people were going around and doing a water audit in their school and making sure that they were using as much water efficiency mechanisms and tools as possible to reduce the amount of water that was coming out of the school and going into the watershed. Another thing you can do is make rain barrels. So collecting water in your backyard or at your school and using that for irrigation. So you're recycling that water is another really good tool so that it doesn't just flow into directly into the gutters and into the rivers, into the ocean.
And one other thing is, Philippe, we have a dog. So when we walk the dog, we always make sure that if we see a piece of trash, especially plastic, we pick it up and we bring it home. And
even if it's not ours.
Yeah, even if it's not ours, because we know, especially in California, if it does rain, that water goes directly into the ocean. So every time we see a plastic bag or a balloon or a water bottle, we pick it up and we put it in a trash can. So we make sure that no animals are harmed once it gets out to the ocean.
Ooh, balloons. You mentioned that. I know everybody loves balloons for parties and things like that, but at home we have stopped using balloons because a lot of times those balloons end up going up into the atmosphere and then eventually they lose their helium and they come back down. And we've seen a lot of balloons in the ocean and a lot of animal suffering because of, you know, balloons that were let go and ended up down in the water. So we actually don't use balloons at home as well. And straws, single-use plastic bottles, plastic bags. So reducing, there's a reason that you've all heard reduce, reuse, recycle. Everybody immediately goes to recycling, but there's a reason that it's the third one on the list. First, we want to reduce the waste and the trash and the stuff that we do, so we can look around our homes and think about all the stuff that we can do, and how we do those things and make less and help with our friends and at school, as we said. And then we can reuse things a lot, reusable bags, reusable bottles, and then recycling is the third option. That should be the last resort.
All right, that is some wonderful advice. And I can see in the eyes of our on-camera students that they're ready to hold their adults accountable and make some changes around their houses. I think they're going to leave this call and go go count the recycling.
Right, I see
bins
Ty
and
nodding, yes.
make some positive changes in the Chesapeake Bay and around the country. So I think that's a great place to end. Thank you both, Ashlan and Philippe, for that great practical advice on what our students can do to help with the health of the oceans and help the environment. Keep up the fantastic work. I want to thank our on-camera students today, William, Zoey, Sydney, Kai. Fantastic questions. What a great discussion we've had. This has been such a great conversation. I really appreciate everybody joining us on the live stream as well. We had some fantastic questions. And we're more than halfway through Oceans Week right now, but if you love this live stream and you're watching right now, there's so much more to come still this week. Later today, we're going to learn about adorable sea otters, and then we're going to meet an underwater archaeologist. So make sure you come back and check out some of those events. You can see a whole lineup of upcoming Oceans Week events at home.reachtheworld.org. And before we go, last thing, I'm going to unmute our students. And on the count of 3, we'll give a big goodbye and thank you to Philippe and Ashlan. All right. Actually, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourselves. That would be great. You guys are so good at that. And on the count of 3, let's say goodbye and thank you. 1, 2, 3.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philippe and Ashlan.
Such a pleasure. Thank you for having us. We really enjoyed it.
Thanks.
Bye.